Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Rupert Spira. Rupert is an internationally renowned teacher of a direct method of spiritual self-inquiry called Advaita, or non-duality, which has its roots in ancient Hinduism. He holds regular meetings and retreats in Europe and the US, and is the author of 6 books, including The Ashes of Love, The Nature of Consciousness, and Being Aware of Being Aware. He is also a notable artist who works in the medium of pottery. Our conversation focuses on the core insight of non-duality and the place of consciousness in the natural world. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Rupert Spira. Rupert, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me, James. Very nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too. So maybe we can start with how you came to become a teacher of non-duality.
I never had the intention to speak or even write about these matters. I was an artist for 30 or so years. I had a deep interest all of my life, all of my adult life since my mid-teens in these matters. So I was always studying, exploring, practicing, but it was never an intention of mine ever to speak or write. However, I was writing for my own purposes, and at one stage, a friend of mine suggested that I send a collection of essays to a publisher. I did. They liked them. They published the book, the first book, The Transparency of Things, as a result of which I began to receive invitations to go and speak around the world about these matters, which I was happy to do. I would go off and come back to my studio where I imagined I would spend the rest of my life. But then these invitations began to increase, and I was enjoying it very much. It was, having spent 30 years in my studio, it was nice to be out and about, traveling, and above all, talking about the thing the subject about that I love above all else. So after a couple of years of this, the invitations were such that I could really no longer carry on both lives, my private life as an artist in my studio and traveling the world speaking about these matters. And I just gravitated towards the latter, never having had the intention to do so. I still don't consider myself a teacher, or I just enjoy writing and speaking about these matters. So it came about through no particular volition of my own.
Right. Sounds very organic and very natural.
Exactly. Exactly.
And did you train in other traditions before you came to non-duality, which is what we'll be talking about today?
Well, the non-dual understanding, I would suggest, is the core of all the great religious and spiritual traditions. So I grew up in a Christian tradition and always had a feeling for the Christian tradition. I explored the Sufi tradition, and then I came across the classical Advaita Vedanta tradition from India, and then more recently the Kashmir Shaivite, the tantric approach of Kashmir Shaivism. So I explored in all these traditions, although really my foundation was in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, and then more recently the tantric tradition of Kashmir Shaivism. But it was always the non-dual core of these traditions that interested me. So I felt that I was always exploring the same thing. I didn't have the feeling that I was exploring 4 different traditions. I felt that I was exploring one, the great tradition as it is expressed by various different cultures at different times and places.
And is there a significant difference in the way one teaches in the tradition of Kashmir Shaivism versus Advaita Vedanta?
In the way one teaches, no. The teaching, the way the teaching takes place is like this, through conversation. Sometimes I find myself speaking to 500 people, sometimes to 50 people, sometimes to one person. And the teaching is, or I should say the understanding, the non-dual understanding is continually reformulating itself afresh in response to the situation in which it is being expressed.
And you mentioned that the Kashmir Shaivism is a kind of tantric tradition. What is if it's not in the teaching, what is the difference there in the two traditions?
Yes. Broadly speaking, and it is very broadly speaking, the Vedantic tradition is a path that I sometimes refer to it as the inward-facing path. It is a path that emphasizes the turning away from the content of experience, thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, perceptions, activities, relationships, backwards or inwards to the one that knows them, or the one that is aware of them, the knowing subject of all objective experience. So the Vedantic tradition is, on the whole, an exclusive tradition. It is the via negativa, the excluding of objective experience. Whereas the Tantric tradition is, one could say, an inclusive tradition. The outward-facing path, as I sometimes refer to it, by which I mean the path that includes the content of experience, thoughts, images, feelings, etc. Now, I don't mean the way I've just described them suggest that these are two very distinct traditions. They're not. The Tantric approach is implicit in the Vedantic teaching, the outward-facing path, the path of inclusion. It is implicit in the Vedantic teaching, but is not very often elaborated. In my opinion, the inward-facing path is best, the outward-facing path is best elaborated by the Tantric tradition. And although the converse is also true in the Vedantic, in the Tantric tradition, the inward-facing path is included, but not so much attention is given to it. So I feel that the great contribution that the Vedantic teaching makes to the great tradition is this very clear, clean, precise method of returning one's attention to its source. The great contribution of the Tantric tradition is the realignment of the way we experience the body and the world with our new enlightened understanding. So I don't see these two traditions as opposing in many ways. They both have their strengths, and I wouldn't say they had their weaknesses. It's just that the inward-facing path is not so emphasized in the Tantric tradition, and vice versa, the outward-facing path not so emphasized, although it is implicit in the Vedantic tradition. I grew up in the Vedantic tradition for 20 or so years, and then discovered although I was always practicing without realizing it, the Tantric tradition in my studio as an artist, but it wasn't formalized until I came across the Kashmir Shaivite approach a little later on.
And I guess also Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism, I guess, is in the Tantric tradition, right? This kind of
absolutely, yes,
and that's something that really resonates with me.
Absolutely. The only reason I mention the Kashmir Shaivite tradition of Abhinavagupta and Simaraja is just because that was the tradition that I followed and studied and practiced. But there are very close parallels in the Dzogchen and Vajrayana tradition. Yes, certainly.
Right. And so if we start with the Advaita inward-facing self-inquiry method,
yes.
Could you, maybe for someone who's never heard of this, has no idea what we're talking about, maybe we could begin with why one might do that and what the actual procedure is.
Well, first of all, why one might do that, that's a conversation in itself. The reason why one might do that is because everybody loves happiness above all else. Not just those of us that are interested in spiritual matters, but all 7 billion of us love happiness above all else. And most people seek happiness through objects, substances, activities, states of mind, and relationships. And whilst we do experience periods or moments of happiness, none of these provide the lasting happiness for which everyone, without exception, longs. So at some point, there is this either this recognition or this intuition that the happiness for which we long above all else cannot be found in objective experience. And therefore, there's only one other place to look for it, in one's subjective experience, in one's own being. And this is, in fact, the foundation of all the great religious and spiritual traditions. The kingdom of heaven is within. This understanding stands at the very origin of Western civilization. The words "know thyself" are carved onto the entrance of the Apollo of the temple of Apollo at Delphi, indicating that in order to the knowledge of oneself is the most important knowledge and must be the foundation of not only a fulfilled personal life, but of any truly civilized society. So there are good reasons for exploring the nature of oneself, both personally and in relation to one's relationship with objects and others. So that's why one might embark on this investigation. How one would do this. One could start by asking, for instance, what is it that knows or is aware of my experience? Now, this might not seem a very significant question, but it's interesting that if you think of all the, if you and all your listeners think of all the years you spent, we all spent in education, first with our parents, then our schools, then our universities. How many of us were ever asked by our parents, our teachers, or our professors, what is it that knows or is aware of your knowledge and experience? I've yet to meet anyone who answered that question in the affirmative. I mean, think of the amount of knowledge and experience we have all amassed during our lifetime. But how often do we pause to ask the question, but how come there is experience? With what is experience known? What is it that illuminates or renders knowable our thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, and perceptions? So that this would be one way to begin, just to ask yourself, to allow the contents of experience to unfold, thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, etc., without trying to control them or manipulate them in any way. And then just ask the question, but what is it that is aware of all of this? And then to see what happens to your, not answer that question, don't allow yourself to answer this question verbally, obviously. What is interesting is to see what happens to one's mind as it begins to explore the answer. For instance, let's say that at a certain moment you're sitting at home in the evening and you hear a strange sound in the house. And you wonder, what is that sound? What would you do? You get up and you go towards the place from which the sound originates. You go into the kitchen, you discover it's the kitchen window flapping or whatever. Now, you do exactly the same thing. What is it that knows or is aware of my experience? That question will take the mind in the opposite direction from any objective content. The noise in the kitchen, the sensation at the soles of my feet, the memory of last night's dinner, the thought that I'm thinking of. All of those are objects that we are aware of. The question is, what is aware of them? So this question will invite the mind in this unique direction, this objectless direction. And so that would be the way to begin this investigation into the nature of one's essential self.
And then if we attempt to put language to the experience one might have, if anything indeed happens when someone follows those instructions, perhaps I would say one of the most significant aspects is maybe a kind of collapse of the subject-object divide, going from feeling like I am a separate thing, having experiences that are out there in the world, to a feeling of a unified sphere of awareness.
Yes, at this stage, the collapse of the subject and object has not yet happened. In order to bring about this investigation into ourself, we are making a very clear distinction between the subject and the object of experience. And it is important, at least in the Vedantic tradition, and in fact, the true is also the same in the Kashmir Shaivism tradition. It is important to make this distinction to begin with. Later, as you quite rightly say, we will collapse the distinction between the subject and the object. But for one who is lost in the content of their experience, and who believes and more importantly feels that they are this little cluster of experience called this little cluster of experience, thoughts, feelings, sensations called the body-mind. It is first necessary to take a step back to distinguish ourselves from everything we are aware of. And most people believe it is this body-mind, that is aware of the world. Now, in this first step of the investigation, we realize, no, the body and the mind are objects that we are aware of. It is not the body and the mind that is aware. They are thoughts, images, feelings, memories, sensations. These are things that we are aware of. A thought itself is not aware. We are aware of thoughts. A sensation is not itself aware. Sensations are objects of experience that we are aware of. So at this stage, at this first stage of the investigation, we make a distinction not only between ourselves and all the objects in the world that we perceive, but we make a distinction between our essential self and the objects of the body and the mind with which we normally identify ourselves. Oh, I'm not my thoughts and feelings. These are continually appearing and disappearing in my experience. I am that which experiences them or knows them. So at this stage, we're not yet collapsing the distinction between the subject and object. Before we can do that, it is necessary to establish what the subject of experience really is.
So then, in this, I guess, eliminative approach, right? Whereas I've belied I've let on my tendency, as I mentioned before, towards the kind of tantric, all-inclusive way of thinking about things. But so I guess, in this approach, you're saying I'm not the body, I'm not any particular experience, I'm not any particular feeling, because these are all transient. And you're keeping hold of I, right? So the concept I, in what I was saying, I think I tend to lean towards thinking of annihilate the I and everything else remains, but you're keeping hold of the I here.
It's a matter of language. In the Buddhist tradition on the whole doesn't like the term I, because for them, the word I refers to the temporary finite self that most people believe and feel themselves to be, and quite rightly so. They deny the existence of that self, and therefore they don't like to use the word I. Nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly logical, reasonable. However, the Vedantic tradition uses the word I in a different sense. They use it to refer to not the illusory, temporary, finite self, but the true self. So when we say, I know my thoughts, the I refers to that which knows our thoughts. When we say, I am aware of feelings and sensations, I refers to that which is aware of feelings and sensations. When we say, I perceive the world, we refer to that which perceives. So in this case, the I doesn't refer to a temporary finite self. The I is the common name for that which knows or is aware. So it's important to make that distinction, because if some of your viewers are familiar with Buddhist terminology, the word I immediately, it tends to be associated, they have a very strong association of the word I. Regular people that tend not to be interested in these matters tend to associate I with the body mind, and those who have grown up in the Vedantic tradition tend to associate I with pure awareness or pure consciousness, the knower of experience.
Right. So yeah, as you say, I guess the I, you feel, is just the fact of consciousness, the fact of awareness. It isn't the objects that
being
arise.
Aware. Exactly. Just the simple fact of being aware. In fact, the term awareness, ness, as you know, the suffix ness means the presence of. So the term awareness just means the presence of that which is aware. But being a noun, the term awareness tends to confer a subtle sense of objectivity, albeit a very subtle one, onto that which is aware. So that's why, if language permits, I like to use the term being aware rather than awareness or consciousness, although I use all those words and phrases synonymously. Sometimes I refer to knowing, not conceptual knowing, just the fact of knowing or experiencing whatever it is that is known or experienced.
Right. And so you have consciousness itself, or being aware, and we're talking about non-duality here, right? Advaita meaning kind of pointing to the fact that things aren't fundamentally divided. And tell me if I'm getting ahead of myself again here, but I wonder if this is the moment where, as in the famous non-dual text, I am that, is it you have the I am, the presence of awareness, and then there's this collapsing that we mentioned earlier, where the identification is with everything that appears in consciousness.
Yes, absolutely. Having traced one's way back in one's experience to one's essential, irreducible self, or if we can call it a self, or being, just the fact of being aware, we then, so to speak, turn around again and face objective experience, thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions. And we recognize that the essential nature of what we are, which we have now discovered to be pure awareness, is the essential nature or the absolute reality of what the world is. And hence this equation, I am that, or in the traditional Christian language, I and my Father are one. What I essentially am and what the ultimate reality of the universe essentially is one. In Buddhism, nirvana, the emptiness I find on the inside of myself, is the reality, is identical to samsara, is the reality of all appearances. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. You find these expressions that, as you rightly say, collapse the apparent distinction between the subject and the object, and that is what the term non-duality refers to, the recognition that a single, infinite and indivisible reality underlies the apparent multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves.
I think, you mentioned that the term reality, that reality is this single, undivided, non-dual thing. But then experientially, I think the subject-object collapse, I guess, is another sense in which one realizes there was a false duality. So you mentioned earlier, if you hear a noise in your house, usually there's a feeling of being a self, the noise being at some distance outside of you, and it kind of, the self having the experience of hearing the object. Whereas in my experience in non-dual states, there's the sound, the bundle of appearances that you identify with as the self, they're all just equal, they're of equal status in consciousness. They're all just they're just immediately here.
Yes.
I feel in my experience this sense of a loss of the center, a loss of feeling like I'm located inside my head, and instead there just being a unified sphere of awareness in which everything is kind of aware from within inside.
I completely agree. All experience takes place within the open, empty space of awareness. And that awareness cannot be located in experience in the same way that all movies take place on a screen, but the screen is never located as an object in the movie. Or the other analogy, all dreams take place within the dreamer's mind, but the dreamer's mind itself never appears in the dream. That is absolutely true, and not as you refer, as you say, it's not just an idea. It is a felt sense that one loses the sense of being located in and limited to the body. However, one still perceives from through the body. For instance, you are seeing the front of your computer, not the back of it.
Right.
Why is that? It's because I'm not suggesting that the one that perceives, is located, but you are, we could put it like this, you, the unlocated perceiver, the unlocated presence of awareness, is perceiving through the object of James's body. That's what enables you to see the front of your computer. In order to see the back of your computer, James's body would have to go around the other side of it. This doesn't mean to say that the real you, the real consciousness, is located in you, or indeed is moving around. It's not. When the character that we seem to become in our dream walks down the street, our mind doesn't go anywhere. Our mind is not located in the dreamed world, in the same way that the very consciousness with which each of us are now hearing these words is not located in the world that we perceive. That world is located in it.
Yeah, I think
yes. So you're absolutely right. Yes.
Yes, I think I guess the point I was making is that within this island of experience that you might call James's mind, or the mind associated with this organism. Within that, if we just confine our concerns to that sphere, that's where the collapse happens, rather than making a claim. I think, as you kind of point out, we're not saying that suddenly you zoom out and you take on a perspective, you see everything that's happening in the universe. It's still located here.
Exactly. Another way of saying this is that it's not the illusion of separation that disappears, it's the ignorance that disappears. We still seem to see a multiplicity and diversity of objects. If you look around your book, your room, you don't see one homogeneous, uniform object. You see books and pots and pictures and doors, and you see an apparent multiplicity and diversity of objects. If we make a deep investigation of those objects, we find that they are an appearance of a single reality. That recognition doesn't make the illusion of multiplicity and diversity disappear. It's not the illusion that goes. It's the belief that that illusion refers to objects that are real in their own right.
Right. That's an excellent point. I think the distinction between, I guess, the language that resonates with me is talking about maybe the absolute versus the relative. I am relatively separate in that I'm located a different place to you. There are these relative patterns, but we imbue them with a sense of absolute separation, and that's ignorance, as you say, or why you might call it illusion. Yeah, exactly. So it's not that everything collides into a single point. There's still relative separation, but
yes. When you recognize, just to use another analogy, when you recognize that the landscape in the movie is not a three-dimensional landscape, it is a two-dimensional piece of glass, the illusion of the landscape doesn't disappear. The belief that it is a real landscape, and whatever feelings may be attendant on that belief, disappear, but the illusion remains.
Right, and I think the analogy I think you use often is of the play of light in a movie theater on a screen. That you can see from these two perspectives of really believing the certain regions of light to be a human being, and you get kind of engrossed by the drama, and you think you forget that it's just a two-dimensional display of lights, and you can switch between those two perspectives.
Yes, if I've understood you correctly, James, you can watch a movie and you can either see a three-dimensional landscape. If you're convinced it is a three-dimensional landscape, it may be necessary to turn the movie off in order to discover that it is a two-dimensional screen. Having discovered it's a two-dimensional screen, one can then turn the movie back on and simultaneously see the screen and the landscape. In fact, even to suggest that one sees them simultaneously is not quite right, because it suggests that there are two things there to be seen at the same time. All we see is the screen, either appearing as the landscape or not. So and this is another way of referring to the absolute, which would be analogous to the screen, and the relative, which would be analogous to the movie. The absolute is not somehow behind the relative in some other location, veiled by it, although it is one's belief that the relative is real in its own right that makes it seem as if the absolute is missing. And once it is clear to us that the image is in fact simply a coloring of the screen, then the relative no longer veils the absolute, it shines with the absolute. All it is a coloring of the absolute.
And so I guess this leads us to the idea of separation, the taking too seriously the feeling of being this relatively separate location in reality, and the suffering that can come with that. And we mentioned at the start, the reason to do this might be to find happiness as the kind of, I guess I'm pointing out that could be understood to be the counterpart to the suffering that comes with separation. There is these positive felt states that go along with this sense of union with everything.
Yes. There's nothing wrong with acting as if the body were separate from other physical objects. For this reason, we don't just walk out across a busy road. We wait for the cars, for the break in the cars, because although ultimately there is no distinction between us, that obvious consequences. So there's nothing wrong with provisionally relating to a separate physical body. The problem is that when we believe and feel that we are a separate individual limited self, a self located in the body. If we trace back any afflictive emotion, jealousy, shame, anxiety, they can all be traced back to the belief and feeling that we are a temporary finite self. In other words, afflictive emotions arise on behalf of an ultimately illusory, temporary, finite, separate self. The emotions such as peace or joy, I don't really refer to them as emotions in order to try to make a clear distinction. I don't consider peace and joy and happiness to be emotions that fluctuate with sorrow and anxiety and jealousy. That they are the nature of awareness. When the afflictive emotions are absent, the nature of awareness shines. So happiness in this context is not an emotion that alternates with another emotion, namely unhappiness. It is the background of all emotions. It is veiled by the experience of sorrow or jealousy or anxiety. But just because it is veiled does not mean it is absent. So unhappiness in this context would be the veiling of happiness, not the absence of happiness. The joy, love, peace, happiness, these are the nature of awareness, and because the nature of awareness is always present, they are always present in everybody all the time, but in many cases veiled for much of the time.
I completely agree that is our kind of true nature, and I think it's something that, from the perspective of the separate self, it sounds kind of too good to be true, or the separate self that is in suffering and in unhappiness. If you make it as a positive claim and you say there is this thing called peace or love or joy to be found, that doesn't, I think for a lot of people that doesn't sound right. But so I think it's really the nuanced way that you put it is excellent, because I think we're using these words to point to something experiential, point to what it feels like for
Very
everything
much
to be
so.
unified.
Yes, and this, speaking of language, that this is, as you well know, is right in Buddhism. They tend not to speak very much about happiness. They tend to refer to the absence of suffering, and there's a lot of intelligence in that, because it doesn't reify happiness as an objective state or an objective emotion that one may achieve in the future. I just use the term happiness simply because it is a common name for that which everybody loves and seeks above all else. But I fully acknowledge that one has to explain, as I have done, that what the term means to, so as not to mistake it for just yet another emotion that alternates with all one's other emotions. Yes.
Right. And compassion is also a word that's used a lot in Buddhism for the kind of true nature of the mind, this all-inclusive, embracing, loving quality, which, yeah, I think is also something that people, unless you've experienced this, may sound too good to be true, that if you let go into, or you discover what our true nature is, it does just shine forth with this embracing, loving, compassionate quality.
Yes, because if one discovers one's true nature, one discovers that one's own being is shared with everyone and everything. There is no such thing as an individual or finite being. There is just being, and being is like physical space. It can't be divided up. You can build a wall around it, but you don't divide the space. The space inside the room is still the same infinite space of the universe that it was before the building was erected. Well, the being in each of us is not really in each of us. It is the single universal being from which everyone and everything derives its apparently independent existence. And that recognition is the experience of love. That's what love is. Love is not an emotion or a feeling. It is the recognition of our shared being. That then expresses itself in our behavior as compassion. So I would suggest that love is the very nature of our being. That is, it is shared. Compassionate action is the inevitable consequence of that recognition, simply because one feels the other as oneself.
Right, and you don't need to be told
because the other is one.
Exactly, and you don't need to be told to not harm oneself. It's just self-evident, right? That
no one has to be told not to harm. Exactly. This is why when Saint Augustine was asked about the moral or ethical implications of this understanding, he simply said, "Love and do whatever you want." By which he meant the one thing you have to understand and feel, that everyone and everything share their being. If that's the one thing you understand and feel, and you lead a life that is consistent with that understanding, you don't need any more guidance or teaching in your life. Just live a life that is consistent with that felt understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some other words to focus on the nuances of language in trying to convey these ideas. I've heard you refer to consciousness as eternal and infinite, which is something I agree with. But when, again, in usual everyday language, if you state that, it sounds like a kind of it could sound like a kind of a supernatural claim of it being physically, extended throughout every, and I know, I think it's worth clarifying precisely what is meant by that.
Yes, of course, for a mind that only knows objective experience. All objective experience, by definition, is finite. The idea of the eternal or the infinite is something so far beyond. The finite mind cannot even imagine the eternal or the infinite simply by virtue of the fact that it imposes its own finite limitations on everything that it imagines. So yes, the eternal and the infinite are the finite mind cannot even go there. But and so, as you say, they sound exotics. They seem to belong to some supernatural realm to which we have no contact or no. The opposite is the truth. The word infinite just means not finite. It's not. Eternal just means not in time. So infinite, a less exotic or supernatural sounding word than infinite would simply be unlimited. Or eternal would simply mean ever present, not always present in time, but ever present now. And it's very easy to check this in your experience. If I were to ask you now, describe your current thought, or the sensation of your legs on the chair, or the sight of your room, you would easily describe all these objects, and your description would describe their limited qualities. I was thinking of breakfast this morning. I wasn't thinking about dinner last night. They would all be limited. But if I were to ask you, okay, describe what it is that is aware of your experience, what would you say? We've already ascertained that there is something, let's just call it something, that is aware. So we've established the presence of that which is aware. We now want to explore its nature. So we know that it is present and it is aware. Tell us more about it from your experience.
Yeah, I think it's these might come across as synonyms for aware, because I think it's largely featureless apart from kind of a luminosity.
Okay. It's featureless, yes. It's luminous. That's, as you say, a synonym. It illuminates or knows experience, but it's featureless. Perfect. It's featureless, which means there's nothing to perceive there. It's featureless. It means it's objectless. And if it's objectless or featureless, what is the validity to our belief that it is limited, given that any limit must be objective? And if any of your viewers, indeed, if any of the 7 billion of us had just conducted the experiment, as long as they, of course, understood what we were, our language, if any of the 7 billion of us had conducted this experiment, what is the nature of that with which I am aware of objective experience? We would very quickly come to the same. Most people would go silent. In other words, they wouldn't be able to find a suitable word to describe it. Why? Because our language has evolved to describe the objective content of experience. Our language is very good at describing chairs and books and tables, but there is no language. As you say, it's featureless. That is why the images that are sometimes used to evoke it are silence, transparency, empty, still, motion. These are all, they're not accurate words, but they somehow try to evoke in the listener this featureless, qualitylessness presence of awareness. That's just another way of saying it's unlimited or infinite. So far from being a word that describes some exotic supernatural phenomenon, it is actually everybody's experience that their own being is without limits and ever present.
And so if we think of, you mentioned this, we're gaining insight into our own being, our own nature through these methods. I think there's this kind of tricky issue of, if one takes that to be a kind of goal-directed task, if you act in such a way that you attempt to to get to a place where you've gained insight, that tends to, I think, come from the separate self, come from a certain kind of linear, goal-directed way of being. And you have these kind of certain traditions that are gradual, that suffer from this, that you're trying to get somewhere, whereas actually the insight is that everything is just here, perfect as it is, and that there's really nowhere to go. Do you think that this path, does it suffer from that challenge as well as the kind of gradual meditative paths, or is it more direct in some way?
Any spiritual path makes a concession to the apparently separate self. Because awareness doesn't need any spiritual instruction or practice. It is already infinite. It is already eternal. It is already perfectly at peace. It is already without birth and death. It doesn't need practice. So to whom is the teaching addressed? As we've already said, that there is really no apparently separate self. However, in most cases, the apparently separate self doesn't yet know that. The apparently separate self still believes that it is a separate self, and it is therefore suffering. Let me use one of my favorite analogies that you may have heard. The actor John Smith, who plays the part of King Lear. Of course, John Smith, he lives alone at home in a nice apartment. He's perfectly peaceful and happy. And every night he goes to his theatre, puts on King Lear's costume, adopts King Lear's thoughts and feelings, goes out on stage and becomes miserable because of his relationship with Cordelia and the war with the French and his troubles in his kingdom, etc. Now imagine that the play were to, in other words, John Smith, who represents awareness in this analogy, King Lear represents the separate self. John Smith loses himself in King Lear's thoughts and feelings. Now, imagine that he was to lose himself so completely in King Lear's thoughts and feelings that at the end of the play, he forgot to revert to himself, and that he went backstage and his friend comes to congratulate him on the performance and finds him miserable. And he said, well, why are you miserable? That was wonderful. And he said, oh, and then King Lear starts relating his troubles with his three daughters and the French. And his friend says, don't be silly. You're not miserable because of your daughters and the French. You're miserable because you've forgotten who you really are. Who are you really? He's initiating the process. It's another, you asked, how do you initiate this process of self-inquiry? I suggested, ask yourself, what is it that is aware of your experience? This would be another question. Who are you really? So King Lear starts saying, I'm the King of England, I'm the father of three daughters. Oh, no, his friend says, no, you haven't always been the King of England. You haven't always been a father of three daughters. You haven't always been at war with the French. Go deeper into yourself. Who are you before all of that? So King Lear is tracing his way back through the layers of his experience. And at some point, there is this recognition, I am John Smith. And at that moment, his suffering comes to an end. Now, we could ask the question, well, his friend, King Lear's friend who came to see him backstage, who was he addressing? To whom did he ask the question, who are you really? He asked the question to the apparent person, King Lear. King Lear feels, I am King Lear. So the apparent person, King Lear, hears the instruction and practices self-investigation. John Smith doesn't need to do it because he's already perfectly free and happy. So the teaching is addressed to the one who believes themselves to be temporary, finite, and limited, and is as a result suffering. Now, if the teaching says to that person, there's nothing to do, well, first question is, if the so-called teacher really believes there is nothing to do, why are they teaching in the first place? Well, why are they speaking about these matters and writing books? Presumably they want these, they want, expect people to read them and to listen. So the teaching is addressed to one who believes themselves to be temporary and finite. Of course, the one that the teacher may well understand, and hopefully does understand, that there is no temporary finite self. That the friend in the dressing room, of course, realized that King Lear was an illusion. He knew he was talking to John Smith. However, he made a concession, a compassionate concession to the apparent character of King Lear and gave him something to do. If he hadn't given him something to do, he would just have remained miserable. So it's true from an absolute point of view, there is no temporary finite self. Therefore, there's no question of whether there is or is not something for that self to do. And yet, for one who believes and feels themselves to be a separate self, the question of whether there is something to do or not is really a moot question. They are already doing something. All separate selves are already doing something. What is that? Seeking happiness. So it's too late to tell them there is nothing to do. They are already seeking happiness. So what the teaching says to them is, stop seeking happiness in objective experience. You will never find it there. Seek happiness in yourself.
And so the path for the separate self in this tradition, would it be to, I guess, hear the teachings, read them, go to, listen to a teacher, and do this investigation and hopefully have a kind of sudden direct insight as opposed to a kind of gradual meditative training?
Yes, let's go back to our analogy of King Lear in his dressing room talking to his friend after the performance. His friend finds King Lear miserable and he asks him to do one thing. Who are you really? His question takes King Lear directly back to his true nature, John Smith. Now, another friend, seeing King Lear in this condition, may have said to him, okay, King Lear, sit down. Let's do some breathing exercises to calm you down. Let's take 10 deep breaths together. Or he may have said to him, let me give you a sound to concentrate on, because King Lear's mind is still, he's still perseverating over his daughters and the war with the French. So his friend would say, okay, instead of thinking about all of that, let me give you a sound. Just repeat this sound to yourself. And in this way, he takes King Lear's mind off his troubles and places it on another object, like a mantra. So these are the traditional, progressive, indirect means. I mean no criticism of them by saying this. When I say they are indirect, I mean they don't go directly back to our true nature. They take a step away from the content of our experience. They go halfway back. Instead of focusing on our anxiety and our relationships and our activities and our thoughts, we focus on our breath, or on a mantra, or on a flame, or on a teacher, or the pause between breaths. These are objects. And their purpose is to gather the disparate energies of the mind as a half, until the mind is sufficiently steady and mature and stable so that it can take the next step all the way back. Well, in this approach, which is sometimes referred to as a direct approach, we don't go via any of these objects, a mantra, a flame, the breath. We go directly back to our true nature.
And is there, given that there's so much habit of thought and habit of feeling, I can imagine a situation where John Smith realizes he's John Smith, but then the habit of, if he's been stuck in this illusion of being King Lear his entire life, the momentum suddenly takes him over again a second later. Is there, once someone's had this kind of realization, do you recommend returning to it in a way to kind of stabilize it, or would meditation be a useful way to kind of clear through these habits?
Yes, very much so. Very occasionally there are recorded accounts in the literature of people who ask themselves this question, who am I really? Trace their way back to their true nature, recognize their true nature and its innate peace and joy, and never left. It's possible. It happens. There are accounts. I know of a few. In most cases, there is this recognition, but as you rightly say, the gravitational pull of objective experience pulls us out again, away from ourselves, towards the objective content of experience. And as a result, our self and its innate peace and joy seem to be veiled again, in which case, as you rightly say, one then has to trace one's way back again and again and again. And each time we do so, we are weakening the power that objective experience has to take us away from ourselves. And as a result of this process, we find ourselves beginning to be established in our true nature. So that at some point, this back and forth ceases, and we feel our identity is our true nature, the presence of awareness. We then turn again towards the content of experience on the tantric path in order to realign the way we think and feel and act and perceive and relate with this new understanding of ourself.
Right. I feel like when it comes to the more indirect practices, the analogy of the kind of the blueness of the sky being masked by clouds, I find quite useful. You know, if someone, the sky is always there, it's just always, shining forth, and it's always blue, and it sometimes cannot feel that way, especially if you're from England, I guess. I think I was always, as a kid, surprised when you'd go in a plane above the clouds, and I always forget every time that it's really always blue above the clouds. But yeah, I feel like meditation is a useful way to practice clearing the clouds. If someone has a very stormy mind, they're very unlikely to have the direct insight, even though it's already there.
Yes,
it can help.
Yes, I would. Yes, that's true. I would just like to slightly redefine your or put another suggestion is that meditation it's not really about clearing the clouds. One doesn't have to clear the clouds. As you say, you just go up on an airplane, you go through the clouds, and when you go in a plane, you don't have to clear the clouds first. You just go through them and it's the blue sky. Meditation is like taking an airplane back to your true nature. It is not necessary. If you want to clear the clouds, my goodness, that's a lot of work. I mean, there are, let's only refer to this lifetime. Let's not talk about other life. But, in this lifetime, there is an awful lot of conditioning in each of our minds. If we had to clear all of that before going to our true nature, my goodness, that would be a task. Meditation is anyone can go to their true nature, irrespective of the content of their mind or their body, simply by virtue of the fact that they are aware. It doesn't matter what they are aware of, that they are aware. Awareness is present in their experience, and awareness can let go of the content of experience and come back to itself.
Right. Yeah, and it's worth clarifying that, because I think in a lot of sky metaphors, the clouds are like thoughts that you are clearing, which is not, I agree, is not the way to do it. And I guess I meant it in the sense of habitual patterns or conditioning, but then the ultimate insight just being pretty much like it's all sky, really. You don't need to clear anything.
Well, it's all sky. I don't mean to imply that it's not valid to address those patterns and conditioning. In the direct path, we first go to our true nature, we recognize its nature, then we turn round again and we deal with those patterns of conditioning, both at the level of thinking, at the level of feeling, and at the level of perceiving, acting, and relating. So I don't mean to imply that all we do in this approach, we go back to our true nature and that's it. No, that's the end of the first chapter. Once we've gone back to our true nature, we've recognized who we are, it is then necessary to reconsider our thoughts. On whose behalf do our thoughts and feelings arise? Do they arise on behalf of the temporary, finite, separate self that we used to believe and feel ourselves to be? Or are our thoughts and feelings an expression of the presence of awareness that we now know ourselves to be? And indeed, our activities and relationships, in whose service do they arise? Do they arise in service of a separate self, or the true and only self of infinite awareness? So that's important. In this approach, the reconditioning of the mind and the body happens after the recognition of our true nature, whereas in most spiritual paths, it happens before.
Right, and I completely, that's been my path as well, rather than the gradual path.
Yes.
I think that's a wonderful way to approach it.
Yes. And just one other thing to say about meditation is that one's understanding of meditation changes. Inevitably, King Lear feels that he is King Lear. So he feels that meditation is something that he, as a person, practices with the purpose of discovering his true nature or whatever. Of course, that is true only from the illusory perspective of King Lear. That's how it seems to begin with. In time, we realize that meditation is not something that we do as a person. Meditation is what we are.
I think that's a wonderful way to say it, because when I say meditation, I absolutely mean this kind of a non-dual dropping into this awareness, practicing, cultivating, rather than doing.
Yes. To meditate is simply to be knowingly the presence of awareness. We don't become it through practice. Doesn't need to be maintained by effort. We simply cease imagining and feeling that we are a temporary finite self, and we simply are knowingly this presence of awareness. So there's this transition from the feeling of meditation being an activity that we do to the recognition that it is in fact our nature.
And because in this picture we're investigating our own nature, and we come to find that there is some correspondence between our nature and the nature of all of reality, I think that can lead us to certain, I guess, metaphysical models of the nature of reality. And I think here, when it comes to experience, I think we've been very much in alignment. But I think you seem to adopt a kind of consciousness-only ontology.
Yes, I would. I would suggest that even from a conventional materialistic perspective, whatever we are as a person or a body is a byproduct of or emerges from the universe. Therefore, whatever we are essentially must be the same as what the universe is essentially. After all, the universe gave birth to us. So even from a materialistic perspective, the idea that what we essentially are and what the universe essentially is it's obvious. It's so, of course, there we're in agreement. Where we may diverge is as to what the nature of this shared reality is. I would suggest that, having explored myself and discovered that consciousness is the essential, irreducible nature of myself, that's something I can verify in my own experience. Having agreed that whatever I essentially am must be the reality of whatever it is that gives birth to me as an apparent person, it's a small step from there to conclude that consciousness must therefore be the reality of the universe. So I would suggest that underlying the apparent multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves, there is a single, infinite, and indivisible reality whose nature is spirit or consciousness. Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree that there's a single, indivisible reality, and that, as you say, we can extrapolate from ourselves that we are made of the same stuff as everything else in the universe. And I think that the slight difference would be, I guess, I would say, for me, I feel like the experiences we've been talking about shows me, rather than saying I am consciousness, I might say I am the fact of being as is known as in consciousness. So it's illuminated here by consciousness. But
well, okay. But then you posit that being is something known by consciousness. The being and consciousness are two different things. And that's a problem. Can you say from your experience, I am?
I would be tempted to just say am or is, because of my predilection for the Buddhist approach.
Indulge me my Vedantic background and allow me to. Okay,
yes,
am, yes, but I am or am. In other words, you can assert the presence of your being.
Yeah, the presence of being.
You can,
yeah.
The presence of being, perfect, not your being. You can assert the presence of being. There is, we could say, there is being. Yes, that's what, when I say I am, that's what those words mean. I'm asserting the fact of being. Yeah. Now, how is it possible for us to assert that there is being? We're not guessing it. We're not imagining it. We assert that there is being because we know it. It's our experience. There is being. Being is known. Yeah. Can we say being is known?
Mm-hmm.
The common way of, if you'll let me use the word I, everyone can say I am. The reason we can say I am is because I know that I am. Now, what is it that knows that I am, or that there is being? Is the being that I am known by, or the being that is, or the being that I am, known by something other than itself? Or is it the being that I am that knows itself? In other words, when we say, I know that I am, is the I that I am a different I from the I that knows that I am? Or when we say, I know that I am, is it not the same I that I am that knows that I am?
I completely agree that it is. It's the same thing of
But
being
there
that knows
you
itself.
have to conclude, well, perfect. And therefore your distinction between consciousness and being is not valid.
I think
you cannot say that being is appearing in consciousness, because it contradicts what you've just agreed.
No, I think I would say that consciousness is not, you said, is it known by a separate thing? I would say consciousness is not a thing. It's a capacity or a property of being. Not all being, not a black hole or a supernova. But if
let's take that statement.
This little ripple.
Consciousness is a property of being. Let's just explore that statement. Consciousness is a property of being. In other words, consciousness is something that being has. Okay, if that is true, experientially, if that is consistent with the evidence of experience, you have to be able to produce being in the absence of consciousness and say, look, here is being before it has acquired consciousness. And now here is being with consciousness, and therefore it's reasonable to say consciousness is the property of being. Now, can you do that?
We can't do that because we're confined by only being able to know what's in our own consciousness, right? So I can't show you the Big Bang and say, look at this non-conscious being because of the privacy of consciousness. So I agree that I can't do that, but I don't think it's because non-conscious being doesn't exist. I think it's just the way we're set up. I can't show you the consciousness or the lack of consciousness. If this cup is a physical object that doesn't have consciousness, I can't show you its lack of consciousness in the same way I can't show you the presence of consciousness in my mind. So I feel we have to go beyond experience. It's not from experience that I conclude that I don't think, so the reason I guess I see consciousness as an emergent feature of reality isn't because my experience tells me so, but it's because as I interact with the world, I see the way that vision depends on eyes, which seem to be these physical things.
That's an interpretation. That's an interpretation that there are other interpretations. There are other possible interpretations that do not appeal to the belief in the existence of something outside consciousness from which consciousness itself is generated. Now, whatever this stuff outside consciousness is that is supposed to generate consciousness, it is by definition unknowable to us because everything that we could know appears in consciousness. So this theory it will never be more than theory. And not only that, it appeals to the existence of a substance, namely matter, that we believe exists outside consciousness. Nobody has ever seen it. Nobody's ever found it. Nobody will ever find it or could ever find it. Moreover, we believe that this unknowable substance called matter gives rise to the only thing that we ever know, which is consciousness. Now, if that's not upside down thinking, what is? If that's not convoluted, what is?
I agree. It's
Why not?
theoretical.
The only reason for, sorry to interrupt you, the
That's
only
okay.
reason to imagine the existence of something outside consciousness would be if we couldn't explain our experience, reality, the world, using only the raw data of our experience, namely consciousness. But we can. So just using Occam's razor, should we not stick to the facts of our experience, namely consciousness, and only appeal to the existence of a substance called matter if we can't explain reality in terms of consciousness only? And it turns out we can very elegantly.
I think that's a reasonable approach, and maybe this comes down to personal how convinced one is, because I guess I've not been convinced that we can explain everything in a consciousness only picture. And as I mentioned, just the simple thing of something like the seeming dependence of visual experience on having eyes, and the way eyes seem to be made of smaller kind of systems that we have no reason to believe are conscious, or just trying to think of I seem to. So I would say I am a system that is conscious, whereas a cup is not conscious. In the way you think about this, can you talk about things being conscious, or I guess if there's only consciousness?
James, would you? Can we agree that our mind, an individual mind, is like a mini field of consciousness,
Hmm.
and that within a mind, a thought arises, and the thought is made out of the mind in which it appears.
Hmm.
Would you agree? I mean, the thought is not put into the mind from the outside. It's made of mind stuff, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Can we? Is that a reasonable thing? Now, the thought itself is not conscious. For instance, a thought is not listening to our conversation. The thought appears in your conscious mind. It is made of your conscious mind, but it is not itself conscious. That goes for every thought, every feeling, every sensation, and every perception you have ever had. It is within everybody's experience that all their experience, let's take thoughts, that their thoughts appear in their mind, made of their mind, but a thought itself is not conscious. So here we have evidence that something can appear in consciousness, made of consciousness, but not itself be conscious. Now, how do you know that exactly the same is not true of the cup? That it is also an appearance in consciousness, made of consciousness. It only appears to be a physical object because you are viewing it from a localized perspective. It is that perspective that confers objectivity on the apparent object. But this cup, which you're quite rightly saying is not conscious, can still be made of consciousness, just like the thought that arises in your mind is not conscious, but it is made of consciousness.
I think you're right. In a situation like a dream, as you say, the things that arise are not conscious. The appearances are just appearances in consciousness. And so I think this just brings us back to our different ontologies, because I'm not saying consciousness is conscious. I'm saying physical systems can be conscious, rather than in a consciousness only picture. Yeah, you wouldn't say that an appearance.
But James, it's not your experience that your body, the physical systems are conscious. Your experience is that consciousness is conscious, that awareness is aware. So where do you get the idea that physical systems are conscious from?
From as you say, not from experience at all, but from the kind of philosophical and scientific investigation of the world, trying to fit everything together in a way that makes sense. So, as I said, something like the physical dependency of specific sensory experiences on the brain and sense organs, to me, suggests a direction of causality where the contents of consciousness, at least, are dependent on what we call these physical these physical things like sense organs. And I think my honest feeling is it hangs together more elegantly if I posit that there is that reality isn't made of consciousness, it's made of something. I don't, the word matter is something I'm not that keen on, because it's something, as you say, deeply mysterious, something we can never know directly. But if you entertain the idea, you say, well, could we be in a situation where there was this unconscious process happening, and then at some point it formed certain patterns that became conscious? To me, I say, well, yeah, that to me it seems plausible. I can't show you it directly, but that seems to be what's happened. I don't think of the Big Bang as having the same kind of conscious experiences that I have. It just seems so. I agree that I can't prove it, but in the same way, I'm not a solipsist. I can't prove that you don't have experience. If we just confine ourselves to what we know directly through our own experience, we end up with we're limited.
No, it's very important not to misrepresent what I'm not suggesting that I'm not a solipsist. This is important, because what this consciousness-only ontology that I'm suggesting is often put down by people who relate it to solipsism. And solipsism is obviously an absurd point of view from either of our ontologies. But it's important to clarify that what I'm not suggesting that all there is to the world, the universe, is an appearance in my own individual mind. That would be solipsism.
Right. Yeah.
Only my individual mind exists. Nobody else exists in the world. Nothing. It's just the contents of my mind. That is a position of madness. I think you and I would both agree on that. What I'm suggesting is that everything is appearance in a universal consciousness, and that each of our individual minds are localizations of that universal consciousness, made only of that in that universal consciousness, made only of that universal consciousness, from whose limited perspective its own activity appears as the universe, just as does the dreamed world. And the dreamed world only appears to the dreamed character that we seem to be in the dream through their eyes. Physical eyes are necessary. The dreamed character, the one that perceives the dreamed world, needs their eyes to see, need their ears to hear. But when we wake up, we realize that it wasn't their physical eye, physical ears that were hearing. What appeared as physical eyes were just how this localization of consciousness appears from another point of view.
And so in this picture, what we're experiencing right now is very similar to a dream. Is that right? It's in the same way that in a dream, everything that appears is made of consciousness. That's what's happening.
It's similar to a dream, except that when we have a dream, when we have a dream at night, our mind localizes itself as a single point of view within its own dream, the dreamed character that we seem to become. I would suggest that universal consciousness is, in a sense, dreaming or imagining the universe. In other words, the universe is its activity, but it has the capacity to localize itself as numerous points of view within its own dream. And every sentient being is one such localized perspective within universal consciousness, made of universal consciousness, from whose perspective or through whose agency it perceives its own activity as a universe.
And before we run out of time, I wanted to make sure to ask you about the if there's any link between your art as a ceramicist and these kinds of this non-dual perspective on reality.
Yes, as an artist, I was interested in beauty. I was fascinated by the experience of beauty. I experienced beauty often, looking in nature, looking at objects, listening, tasting. I I had the experience of beauty and loved the experience of beauty. I wanted to make objects that conveyed or precipitated this experience of beauty for people. So to begin with, I didn't realize the deep connection between my love of beauty and my love of truth. I thought they were two, but because I started off on the Vedantic path, which tends to turn away from sense experience, these two areas of my life were rather separate and sometimes in conflict with each other. It was only later, when I discovered the tantric approach, that I realized that beauty, the experience of beauty, is the collapse of the subject-object relationship. Just in other words, beauty is an intervention of the non-dual reality into our everyday, ordinary subject-object way of seeing things. And exactly the same is true of love. Again, love is the revelation. Love is not a relationship between two people. It is the collapse of the distinction between two people and the revelation of their shared being. So everybody experiences non-duality regularly through the experiences of love and beauty. Love in relation to people and animals, beauty in relation to objects. Love and beauty are the experiences in which the subject-object relationship collapse and their shared reality is revealed. So yes, it was the experience of beauty that led me to want to be an artist in the first place, because I saw these beautiful objects in museums. Wherever I was traveling, I would go to the national museums and find these wonderful collections of Chinese and Korean and Japanese pots. And so it was the arts first awakened my interest in the experience of beauty. And it was only later that it became clear to me that the experience of beauty is the revelation of the reality of everyone and everything. What we call it, or what we think it is made of, in the end, it doesn't matter. You may call it whatever I may call it. In the end, it doesn't matter, because we both agree, and this is why I'm very glad, James, that we spoke mostly about our internal experience and just briefly touched on this at the end, but didn't get into an argument about this, because in the end, the nature of reality cannot be named for reasons we said earlier. Language has evolved to describe the parts. So it's best to leave it unnamed. Then there's no argument. But whatever you call it and whatever I call it, the implications are the same. Namely, there is a single reality. And all that is necessary is to understand this, to feel this, and to lead a life to the best of our ability that is consistent with this felt understanding. And I think on that, I think we completely agree.
We completely agree. Yeah, there's so much we agree, and to get hung up on the language of a particular intellectual model of understanding this is really not the thing to spend our time on.
I'm less and less inclined these days. I noticed that we started off this conversation on a different tack, and I thought, oh, that's nice. We're not going to. And then at the end, you introduced it, which was quite right that you did, but in a very nice way. And I'm glad that it so often those conversations lead to conflict and disagreement.
Yeah.
But I'm very glad that even though we may name the ultimate reality differently, the importance is we both feel it and lead a life that is consistent with its implications to the best of our abilities. So I'm less and less inclined to be drawn into debates, which often degenerate into arguments about this and miss the essential point, which is usually shared by both parties.
Exactly. Yeah. No, this has gone exactly as I'd hoped. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah. This has been wonderful.
Yeah,
would you direct would you direct people anywhere in particular if they want to follow up on your work?
Just go to my website. Probably is the best thing. rupertspira.com.
Okay, great. And thanks again.
Or YouTube. There's lots on YouTube.
I'll put some links in the description.
Good.
Thanks.
Thank you, James. Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, you too.